Well, good afternoon. How are you doing today? Great. I'm doing well. I want to welcome you to our third session of our Technical Communication Workshop. My name is Amy Barton, and I'm going to be starting today's workshop. And then Mary Kay Ballant, who's sitting right up here to my left, she's going to continue, and she's going to do an exercise with you. Both of us work with John Bricado, who's led the first two workshops. We are in the Technical Communication program in the College of Engineering, and we both teach technical writing. So we have students of our own, and a lot of our examples that we use are from our own students. And I'm really excited to get the chance to talk to a new group today and get to know you and your concerns. So please feel free to stop me if you have any questions, if you want me to slow down or repeat something, or if I'm not covering something that you would like to know, please don't hesitate. I see this as an informal chance for us to talk and really make sure that we address your particular concerns. To start, I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet and just ask if you've been here before, you're familiar with this, but just to put your name, your net ID, and just to list the instructor or course who asked you to attend, if that's the case, and if not, if you're just coming on your own, then you don't have to put anything for that blank. Okay? Well, today's topic is paragraph development, and it really extends to paper development. We're talking about how to take the sentences that you learned about if you were here last week, shape them together, and make coherent, unified paragraphs that work together to form a coherent, unified document. And a lot of what you're going to hear will be similar to some of the instruction that Mr. Bricado gave you last workshop, because sentences and paragraphs, they really work together. They're hand in hand. It's not as though when you start writing that you develop all your sentences and then you arrange them magically into paragraphs. You're working on them together. So you might have some ideas. You might shape those ideas into tentative paragraphs. And then you might need to go back and rearrange your sentences, improve your sentences, and then go back and look at your paragraph again. So you're often going back and forth, and one is very dependent on the other. So we're going to talk some about sentence development today as well, and hopefully get some continuity between the two topics. First, I want to talk about the basic definition of a paragraph and the different types of paragraph, because I think that's going to help you understand how they work together as part of a unified document. So when you think about a paragraph, I'd like for you to think about it as a separate, independent thought. It should function well on its own. It should have a beginning and an end. It should feel like a unit of thought. But it also works together with other paragraphs to form the document. And so it's separate, but it's also part of a whole. I like to think of it as a link in a chain. Each link is independent, but they're all connected. And so you have to think about the whole as you're thinking about the parts. When you think about sentences, last workshop, Mr. Bricado talked about sentences and how they need to work together and how they need to be clear. But honestly, if you have a fuzzy sentence, a sentence that doesn't work all that well on its own, readers might be able to forgive that. But if the entire paragraph doesn't work well, that's something readers cannot get past. Because what readers tend to do, they don't pause after every sentence. They'll read the entire paragraph, and then they'll pause for understanding. And if they're having trouble understanding the paragraph, then there's a major problem. The chain breaks, the link is broken, and so the entire paper structure can easily break down, and the paper can become very unsuccessful. So I want you to think about paragraphs as divided into three broad categories, and together these categories shape the document. You have the introduction, you have the body paragraphs, and then you have some kind of resolution, some kind of closing at the end that pulls everything together. So what I'd like to do is take you through those three categories, talk about what needs to happen in each, the types of paragraphs you'll find in each, and hopefully you'll see how they're building together and how all three categories work together. The introduction, to the body, to the closing. And then we'll also talk about specific types of paragraphs in each. So first, the introduction. Sometimes the introduction is one single paragraph. Sometimes it's multiple paragraphs that work together. Essentially, though, an introduction is going to do two things. It's going to give the reader an idea of what to expect in the rest of the document. So in that way, it becomes context, background the reader needs to know, and then a preview of what's coming. So in a lot of ways, the introduction is supposed to give you some real information that's going to help you understand what's to come. But the introduction also should compel you to want to read more. You shouldn't feel like you're finished when you read the introduction. A good introduction, when I read my student papers and I read a really good introduction, it feels relevant. It feels like it's meaningful to me. It feels like I really want to read more. And it also feels like a good investment of my time. It feels like I'm ready to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes reading the rest of this paper because you've pulled me in. You've made me want to know more. So you have to think about it in both ways. It stands on its own because it's a good preview and it provides background, but it also just makes you feel like you've got to read more. You've got to dive into the rest of that paper, into the body. So that's something really important to keep in mind. When you think about an introduction, I like to think in terms of shape with these paragraphs. If you had to assign a shape to an introduction, a symbolic shape, it would be a funnel. You start out broad, and you move to increasingly narrow points so that you end with your most narrow point, which is usually called the thesis statement. It's really a preview of the paper's main points of what's coming in the body. So when you start out broad, a lot of my students tend to ask, how broad is too broad? Sometimes you can be too broad. Sometimes you can start out way out in the atmosphere somewhere so that you have to take too long to get to your specific point. And that's when you know that you're going to create some gaps in your introduction. A good funnel doesn't have any major gaps. So you have to think about taking the reader progressively, step by step, to your most specific point, and starting out broad, but specific enough so that you don't have to create those gaps. So how broad is too broad? I'm going to give you some examples of some first sentences, some opening sentences of your introduction, some that don't work too well, and let's see what we think about them. When I read student papers, again, examples for my students, sometimes opening sentences fall into one of these categories, and sometimes I get tired of seeing the same opening strategies. Now, it's hard to begin a paper. I'm going to admit, when I write a paper, the introduction is probably the hardest part for me because I find it difficult to introduce something that hasn't been written yet. So one strategy that works for me is to write the body and then go back and write the introduction. And I think that works for a lot of people as well because then you know what you have to introduce. So it gives you a sense of how broad you need to start and it makes the narrowing a little bit easier. If you're really struggling to come up with that opening sentence, maybe start with the body. Start to gather some information, do some research, really have an idea, an outline of where you want to go, and then you might come up with an idea that's going to be an interesting way to involve your reader. So the first sample that doesn't work so well, let's say we're writing a paper about some topic related to heart disease or some advancement to help with heart disease. Have you ever wondered what happens during a heart attack? Any ideas about why that might not be such a good opening strategy? It's a common strategy. A lot of people think I've got an introduction, I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to ask my reader a question. But the problem is the reader's not really going to respond. A paper's not typically written that way. You're not having a conversation, a dialogue back and forth with your reader, and it's really overused. It's also informal to talk directly to your reader. You really want to, in formal writing, try to avoid using second person unless you're writing a set of instructions, telling your reader directly what to do in step 1 and step 2 and so on. So generally asking the reader a question, it's overused, it's not a very successful strategy, it's not helping your reader. I know Mr. Mercado has probably talked a lot about making sure that you're thinking about your reader's needs, what's really going to be helpful and relevant to your reader, and that first example is really not. Now the second, this nice little quote here. Mark Twain once said, "Be careful about reading health books, you may die of a misprint." Now that's kind of cute, especially in today's world of WebMD and all the internet searches that people can do and try to find out what kinds of diseases they might have. But if we're writing a paper about heart disease, What might be wrong with that strategy? Here's a hint. It's a problem that I already mentioned. It's a little too broad, isn't it? It's nice, it's cute, it's something that maybe it is memorable, so in that way it could pull the reader in, but it's too broad. Think about if you're having to make a very specific point about the heart or some procedure or some technology that's going to help with heart disease. You're going to have to make a big leap to get there. You're either going to have a really long introduction or you're going to have to create some kind of gap. So again, I think you're setting yourself up for failure here. I think you're making your job too hard. Now this third one, it's the definition. This is commonly used to begin an introduction. It's a classic first sentence, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. A heart attack is. Now this is specific enough, probably, for this paper. The main problem with it is overused, and it's not going to pull the reader in as dramatically as maybe some other strategies you could use. Maybe it's important to have that definition in the introduction, maybe not as the first sentence though. So this is not a terrible strategy, maybe not the best opening sentence strategy. All right, the last one on our list, the human body is a wonderful machine. Any ideas about what's wrong with this one as a first sentence? Exactly. So it's a lot like the nice quote from Mark Twain. It's just too broad, and it's something that doesn't really give us any new or valuable information. It's common sense. Too often my students start out with something that's very common sense. Everybody wants efficient manufacturing processes. Well, that's nice, and I do agree with that, but it's a little too obvious. So maybe start out with something that's a statistic that shows the demand for efficient processes, the time it takes, the number of a particular product that people buy every day, which shows the number that must be produced. So something that's a little more interesting, a little less common sense to get us started. So those are some that don't work so well. So let's move on, and let's talk about the other end of the introduction. Another problem is when, let's say the writer thinks of a great first sentence strategy. Maybe for heart disease, it's some statistic about the number of people who die of heart disease in this country every year. That would be compelling because it shows me that it's relevant. It shows me that it's something that I should care about. Maybe some news article about someone who was one of the first patients to try this new experimental therapy. That would get me interested because then I care about that patient and I want to know what happened to help his life get better, to help his health. But now we're at the thesis statement, the last sentence of the introduction, which is supposed to be, remember the funnel, it's supposed to be the most narrow. So it's the one that's focusing the rest of the paper and making us want to read more. It's the culmination of everything that's come before. Here are some potential problems. So remember, this is the last sentence of the introduction. Announcement. A lot of students think, I'm just going to make an announcement. I'm going to solve the mystery here. I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to write about this, and I'm just going to tell you my topics that I'm going to write about. I'm going to discuss what happens during a heart attack. What's wrong with that? You're right. It's not a conversation. It's not that personal. You don't need to hear what I am going to do, and it's too obvious. You don't want to be that obvious. It makes you sound like you're a third grader trying to start your first essay. So we need to be more subtle than that. It might be true, but we don't want to proclaim it. This is too vague. The second one, several processes occur during a heart attack. Now, you might be focusing on the different stages of a heart attack. What could you do to make that more specific, though, and more suitable? Maybe you could list the main stages. Heart attacks typically occur in 3 stages, and then you list those 3. That way, it's a better preview of what's actually coming. Another vague example is this third one. There are many advantages of the fully implanted electronic heart pump. So now this is a slightly different take on the heart disease. Now we're talking about a treatment, but it's still vague for the same reason as the previous one. We're going to talk about reasons. Why don't we preview the main reasons? Why don't we give a little bit more information than just some reasons exist? So now the last example is the most focused, and this is the one that really helps me understand how you've narrowed your focus, exactly how you're going to treat your topic, and it makes me want to read more. While this fully implanted electronic pump cannot replace careful patient monitoring, it offers heart disease patients greater mobility and increased survival rates. So now when I envision this paper, I'm envisioning 3 major points that you're going to make. One is the drawback of it, that it can't replace doctors actually monitoring their patients. But then we have 2 benefits that we're also going to explore: the mobility it gives patients and then survival rates that increase. So now I understand, I can predict how the document's going to unfold, and that's going to create a more coherent document. That means that I have a really good plan, and I feel confident in reading the rest of this paper because I feel like I know where you're taking me, and it feels sufficiently narrow. And notice the language: while this fully implanted electronic pump. That implies that previously I've identified it, so I've gone through a progression, and now this is just the natural endpoint of that progression, and I'm ready to start the body. So now let's move on to the body. Body paragraphs, they follow the introduction. You might have many body paragraphs. You might have 3, as you might expect in that previous thesis statement about the implanted electronic heart pump. Or you might have many more than that. But no matter how many you have, they're going to follow some basic rules. One, think of it like I said at the beginning. It's a link in a chain. Every body paragraph is going to express one main idea. So I should get a sense of fulfillment after reading that body paragraph. You make a promise at the beginning, you fulfill the promise throughout, and at the end, you show me that you've done what you promised. And then you're ready to move on to the next link in the chain. They all need to be connected, though, using some transitions, and I'll show you some strategies for that. Think about the order of your body paragraphs. Think about the way the reader's going to interact with your document. You want to take excellent care of your reader. So in the introduction, through that funnel, you're gradually pulling your reader into the specifics of the document. Then when you get into your body, you're making sure that they can see how each paragraph supports the points that you made in your introduction and specifically your thesis statement, how they're connected to all the other body paragraphs, and you want to choose a method of organization that seems logical. So for your topic, if it's a concept, you might want to go from simple to advanced so that you're layering information. You start out with the most basic definitions and equations, and then you build on that. You get increasingly difficult. A lot of papers in computer science have this same format where they're building, they're showing how algorithms are developed or how algorithms are tested. That's one method. Another method might be chronological. Maybe you're talking about a process, so it's obvious that you need to begin at the beginning and you need to take us carefully through the steps, showing us relationships between steps. Maybe it's a physical description of a device. So you think about what makes sense. Should you describe from outside in, from inside out, clockwise? What most important component to least? What's going to make the most sense? But you want to always think about your reader when you're making that decision. What's going to be most natural? Really, when you write a paper, you're showing a method of ordered thinking that you have in your mind. When I read my student papers, I always tell my students that when I read them, what shines through more than their ability to write is how they're thinking about their topic. Are they thinking about it in an ordered, sensible way, or is their thinking disordered for some reason? Often, writing really reveals what people don't understand. If they're kind of confused about their topic, it comes through in their writing. And in another sense, not only are you showing the way that you think, you're projecting, you're telling your reader how to think about something. So that's a lot of power, and it's also a lot of responsibility. So you need to really think it through as you're deciding the way you're going to order your body paragraphs. And like I said, each paragraph is a link in a chain. Transitions are so important to create a document that flows well together. Your reader may not be able to see the relationships that are so obvious and clear to you. You're the expert. Maybe your reader is not. You're so close to your research, but your reader is not. So you might think, oh, these connections are obvious. The reader can figure it out. And that's really the wrong way of approaching the document. It's your job to make sure those connections are emphasized so the reader doesn't have to figure it out. The reader then can focus more on your content, especially if the material is difficult. If it's very technical information, the more you can do to show your reader relationships, the much easier time your reader's going to have really comprehending the difficult material. So that's something really important to keep in mind. And then, if you want to think about some key words for body paragraphs, they must be unified, meaning one main idea. They must be coherent, so they must be fluid. They must flow. The ideas must naturally flow into one another. They must be engaging. You have to keep your reader interested. You made me so interested in the introduction, but you can't lose me midway through the paper. You have to keep me going. You have to make sure that I continue to feel it's a good investment of my time. And they also have to be well developed. So think about making sure that you're supporting all your points adequately so your reader gets good substance as well as style. So now let's go through each of those points, and we're going to start with unified paragraphs. So the first term to know with unity is topic sentence. The topic sentence is the first sentence of your body paragraph. That's where you really tell the reader the topic and the strategy you're going to use to develop the topic. If you think about it, even though it's called a topic sentence, you have to do a little bit more than that because the whole paper is really about the same topic. You have to show the reader how you're going to treat the topic in this particular paragraph. When you think about a body paragraph and a topic sentence, it actually doesn't work the way a lot of people think. If I'm thinking about something, maybe I'm going to go through all of my options and do all my thinking, and then I'll come to a conclusion at the end. And I'll say, therefore, none of these options will work for us at this time. You might think, well, that sounds like a good last sentence because I've gone through all the options, I've evaluated them, I've done my thinking. Good body paragraphs actually work in reverse. You give the main point at the beginning, and then you give the support below. So there's no mystery. You don't really want your reader walking through the thinking process with you. You want to tell them the main point, and then show them how it's important, that how you arrived at that point. And so think about it that way. So let's talk some about topic sentences. What I'm doing here is I'm showing you a topic sentence that has a particular strategy. And I want you to think about how the strategy is expressed in the topic sentence. So for this one, just imagine I took the first sentence out of a random body paragraph. We don't have the rest of the paragraph, just the topic sentence. For the ice's depth distribution, the team considered two simple but very different cases. So this is going to be a comparison. What are the key words that tells you you're comparing? Yeah, two simple but very different cases. So I have actually a lot of information in that relatively short sentence. I know we're going to compare two things, and I know that we're going to focus on the differences. So even though it's not a long sentence, I have a pretty good idea of where we're going. This one, I think, is clearly a physical description. On each Mars exploration rover, the core structure is made of composite honeycomb material insulated with aerogel. So then, for the rest of the paragraph, I'm going to go through the components inside this rover. The next one is a process. Mitosis occurs in 4 stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. Now, here's a question. I want you to think about this. As you think about this paragraph, just imagine the paragraph that's coming, the rest of the paragraph that you don't have in front of you. That paragraph is going to obviously talk about all 4 stages of mitosis. So think about the kind of detail that's going to be in that paragraph. Just imagine it. Now compare that in your mind to a paragraph that starts off this way. The first stage of mitosis is prophase. Similar, but there's a different treatment implied. Which one is going to go into more detail about prophase? Yes, the second one, because that's the one where prophase is the focus. So not only does this tell us the 4 stages in the process, the 4 terms that we're going to hear talked about, but it also gives us a sense of how in-depth the paragraph's going to go. This feels like an overview. Maybe this is the first body paragraph in a paper that focuses on just one stage. So this is just some context, just some helpful background to get us enough information so that we can focus on something related to that. So really, a topic sentence, a good one, can give your reader a lot of information about the depth, about the treatment of the topic, So really think about crafting a very smart topic sentence that helps the reader. Here's a classification one. In 2006, Pluto was renamed a dwarf planet because it does not meet the International Astronomical Union's criteria to be classified as a planet. So in this paragraph, we would expect some explanation of that classification system and why Pluto no longer can be classified as a planet. And finally, exemplification. This means using examples to illustrate a point. The concept of the space elevator, which is a really cool idea, by the way, has many technical problems to overcome before it can become a working reality. So in this one, we're going to expect to hear a listing of those problems. So it's going to be about that list, illustrating that concept. So when you think about your topic sentence, a little test you can do to make sure you have a topic sentence that's really going to help your reader. Here's what you should ask yourself. 1, does it declare a specific point that can be fully supported in one paragraph? I think sometimes when people think about dividing paragraphs, they just think, okay, this looks like too much information for one paragraph, so I'm just going to cut it right here in the middle. That looks about right. So they just eyeball it based on length. Or they do the opposite. They say, this is a short paragraph, only 3 or 4 sentences. I'm just going to smack these two together, and now I've got a paragraph that looks about right. That's not helping the reader. So you have to think really carefully, is this a point that can be fully supported in one paragraph? And if it looks like 2 points, then it probably is. And that might be something to have in the back of your mind, develop the rest of your paper, and then make that decision, whether you maybe need a split. So one full idea, one full strategy in a paragraph. Does it advance the paper's overall goals? Really important to go back and consult your thesis statement. Look at your introduction. Are you deviating? And that's easy to do. For me, sometimes one good idea leads to another idea, which leads to another idea, and pretty soon I'm way off topic. So I have to pull myself back, continuing to go back and look at an outline, a thesis statement. That can be very helpful. And then 3, is there an obvious relationship between this topic sentence and any body paragraph that came before it? Let's say this is not your first body paragraph. Then you have to think about not just how it works with your introduction and thesis statement. You need to think about how it works with everything else. And that can be a challenge because everything, again, needs to fit together nicely. And you might not do all of this as you're developing your paragraphs. This is something that you can do again and again, particularly after you have the paper completed. Go back and look for relationships. If there are any gaps that seem to be obvious, try to make sure you establish some connection for the reader. It's a good idea, too, to get some feedback from someone who's not an expert. They can often point out those gaps that are so easy for you to overlook because you're very knowledgeable about the topic. Here's an example. Do you remember on the previous slide that topic sentence about Pluto not being classified as a planet anymore? So let's say this is the next paragraph. I've already done the classification paragraph about why Pluto is not a planet anymore. Next body paragraph is going to be, although headlines focused on Pluto's demotion, equally important is the evolving discussion about planet classification. So now just think about the subtle change. Now I'm talking about generally how planets are classified. But I've reminded the reader what the previous paragraph was about so that now there's a sense of unity, of continuity, of coherence in the document. Does that make sense, how that works? So those types of transition words and phrases, they can be very helpful in a new topic sentence because they can blend the document and show the reader these aren't separate units of information. Yes, they deal with different strategies, but they all work together. And it can also remind your reader of the thesis statement. This could be reminding the reader of a point that you made in the thesis statement that's helping them to see the document as a whole. Now, so we talked about unity, one main idea, starting with the topic sentence. Now we need to talk about coherence, and this is where we get into the body of the paragraph itself. So beyond the topic sentence, how do we develop that paragraph? So the sentences flow, and this is probably similar to some of the information that Mr. Mercado gave you in the last session about sentences. The idea is to make sure that every sentence supports that topic sentence and that the relationships between sentences are clear. This might be a last stage that you go through of polishing. I know for me, I go through many stages of editing and polishing, and I always find something to change. I'm never happy with it. In fact, a lot of times the due date will be here and I'll feel like I wish I had a few more days, because every time I read it, I find something new that I want to change or add or that I'm not happy with. So as you go through, look for places to add those transitions within the paragraph and, like I said, between paragraphs. And think about those topic sentences again. That comparison paragraph about the two simple but very different cases. Within that paragraph, if I use transition words and phrases like likewise or however or in contrast to, that's going to remind my reader of the topic sentence. It's going to remind my reader of the strategy and create this sense of coherence throughout the paragraph. It's also going to help the reader be more likely to read the sentence the first time and understand it. Because we like to classify. We love to put things in nice little boxes. If all of a sudden, right outside this window, we've heard a strange noise for a while, if a really strange noise were to happen, something we've never heard before, we'd get up and rush over to the window and we'd look outside, and what if we saw something crazy out there? Something that we've never seen in any context before. The first thing we would do is try to classify it. We try to put it in a nice little box. We try to think, does this look like something I've seen in a movie? Does it smell like anything I've smelled before? Does it sound like anything I've heard before? And that would make us feel a little bit better if we could classify it in some way. We're like that when we're reading too. We want to classify. So if I see the word however at the beginning of a sentence, before I read anything else in that sentence, I already know how to classify it based on the previous sentence. I know it's going to be a contrast or an exception. And so it gives me a sense of reassurance. It gives me a sense that, okay, I feel good about this process. I feel like I know where we're going. And those little touches, it seems so subtle just to throw a word in here or a phrase in there. It can make all the difference. It can really help the reader feel like, I get it. I see where you're going. I understand it, because it's frustrating for me when I have to reread. If I've got a bunch of student papers and then there's one that's so difficult, I've got to read it again and again and again in order to understand it, I feel stupid because I get frustrated with myself. I think maybe I'm not paying attention, maybe I'm distracted, maybe it's me. And then I might get frustrated with the student and think, no, it's the student. The paper is not helping me to understand it quickly and move on. You probably had that. Have you ever read a textbook page or maybe something that's difficult, like a journal article, and you find yourself reading the same sentence or paragraph again and again and again? You can feel pretty silly when you're doing that. A lot of times it's because the writer didn't take enough care to pull you along, to show you relationships. So really important. So see all these different categories of transition words and phrases. Use them to help your paragraphs flow and to reinforce that topic sentence. Another way to improve coherence to help paragraphs flow is to create something called verbal bridges. And verbal bridges, just what they sound like, bridges that use words to connect ideas. Repetition can be one way to do it. Needless repetition is not a good idea, and I'm going to show you an example of that a little later. But sometimes repetition of very important terms or new terms can be so helpful, because when you're trying to learn something, one of the strategies is to repeat it. If I were going to go to the grocery store after this session and I didn't want to write anything down, didn't want to write my list down, and I just had maybe 5 things to get, I would say the 5 things over and over and over again in my mind, because then I'd probably still forget, but because that's just me. But if you do that, it's going to increase the chances you're going to remember. So when you're writing, you're teaching readers. You're teaching your reader information. And it's wrong to think, it's naive to think, that the reader's going to remember everything you say, because most people don't work that way. They're impatient, they're distracted by other things. They might remember only a fraction of what they read that you've written. So a good writer remembers that and thinks, how can I improve the chances that the reader's going to remember the right things? Repetition is one way to do that. So here's an example. Conversion. Some form of converting or conversion is what's important in these couple of sentences. So a careful writer might repeat that. Might think, if I repeat it, it gets stressed, the act of converting or the conversion is clear, and then my reader's more likely to remember it. Here's another sample. This came from a student paper. And I liked the way the student was careful to repeat solubility, because that was the major point of the paragraph. And there's a chance that you could over-repeat that word. Let's say you had two back-to-back sentences, two consecutive sentences that started with the word solubility. That might not be a great strategy, because then readers can get lulled into that pattern and they can stop paying attention to the content. But I think this was about right. We didn't have two consecutive sentences that started exactly the same way, but we have enough repetition that at the end it's very clear what the main point of the paragraph is. We even have an it thrown in here. In that same sentence, the writer had mentioned solubility. It was clear what it was referring to, so that counts as repetition as well. That's another form of repetition, and as long as there's no confusion about what that pronoun refers to, then that's perfectly fine. So that's a device for coherence. Now we've talked about unity, coherence, and now let's talk about keeping you interested. That's really important. Don't think that your reader's going to go along with you for unlimited amounts of time and has unlimited patience, because readers aren't that patient. And especially readers who aren't experts. They tend to become very quick to tune out, to go do something else, to get distracted. So you've got to keep them engaged. How do you keep them engaged? One way is variation. You want to always think about varying your sentence structure. And first, it's important to know there are three different main types of sentence structures: simple, compound, and complex. And we all have a favorite style, one that we tend to rely on and fall back on. One really important thing is just to be aware of what yours is. What's the style that you prefer? A lot of people write in a lot of short, simple sentences. And if they do, sentences like this. A simple sentence is just a single independent clause. Paul waited for the bus. If you continue to use strings of short, simple sentences, readers get lulled into a rhythm, and they stop paying attention to what it is that you're actually saying. And you want to shake that up. You want to wake them up a little bit so that they don't feel hypnotized by the rhythm. The next type of sentence is the compound sentence. This is joining independent clauses with some kind of conjunction, like and or but or for. Paul waited for the bus and he checked his messages. So that's a compound sentence. Maybe this is your type. Maybe this is the one that you tend to use a lot. Complex sentences, you've got one independent clause and at least one, often more than one, dependent clause. So here's another example. While Paul waited for the bus, he checked his messages. While makes this first clause dependent, a subordinating conjunction. It can't stand alone. So that's a complex sentence. Sometimes you have some kind of combination, like a complex compound sentence. Know your type. Look at your paragraphs. Think about a typical paragraph for you. Try to classify your sentences. It might seem like an old-fashioned grammar exercise. It's going to help you, because if you tend to have one type that you use constantly, you could vary it a little bit. If you have a lot of long, difficult sentences, complex sentences, maybe split one of them up and have a couple of short sentences. And if you do that, you're going to wake your readers up. If I were to, and I'm kind of droning on and on and on, if I continue this and then all of a sudden I stop and I don't say anything, everybody's going to look up and they're going to wonder, did she pass out? What's going on? I'm going to wake you up. If I started then shouting, that would wake you up. It's the same thing with writing. You wake your readers up a little bit. So it's not wrong to have a prevailing style, but every now and again you want to wake your readers up. And so variation in that way can be very helpful. Because like I said, too many of any one type, it creates that sense of monotony, of boredom. Another way to wake readers up is to change the order of the subject-verb. So here's an example. The Barrier Islands lie off the coast of North Carolina. That's a typical subject, a typical sentence that has a subject and a verb, a predicate. Then we could invert it and just have the verb come before the subject. Nothing wrong with that. Off the coast of North Carolina lie the Barrier Islands. Notice lie is still the correct verb because the subject, even though it comes after it, that's still the subject. What lie off the coast of North Carolina? The Barrier Islands. So that might give us a chance to avoid that back-to-back sentences starting the same way. Maybe I have a previous sentence that starts with the Barrier Islands. So I don't want the next sentence to start that way, so change things up a little bit. That way, again, you're waking your reader up. Another strategy is to move modifiers. Modifiers are, it's a very broad term. It means anything that modifies something else in the sentence. It could be an adjective modifying a noun, an adverb modifying a verb. It could be a prepositional phrase. It could be an adjective clause, an adverb clause. It's anything that modifies. Sometimes modifiers can be moved. And so here's an example. Wireless technology will make significant advances in the next 10 years. So the modifier I'm thinking about moving is in the next 10 years. If my previous sentence started with wireless technology, I'm trying to find some strategy to change things up. So where would I move in the next 10 years? Yeah, the beginning of the sentence. It works just as well. And now I've made a little revision, and I don't have that consecutive sentences starting the same way for no reason. All right, here's another example. The state employees expecting to be terminated began searching for new jobs. Where could I move expecting to be terminated? Yeah, I could move it to the end. It might be a little confusing there because really modifiers need to be very close, right next to whatever it is they're modifying. So, right at the beginning. Then it's still right next to the state employees, which is what it's modifying. And that's something to be careful of. You want to make sure that you don't move a modifier and then make it confusing about what it's actually modifying. Here's a silly example of that. Running around their cages, the researchers studied the mice. What literally is that sentence saying? Who's running around their cages? Literally, it's the researchers. Maybe they feel like running around their cages and that they're in cages, but probably we mean the mice. So how do we fix that one? Where do we move running around their cages? Yeah, to the end. Then the researchers study the mice running around their cages. Now everything's clear. So just don't get too crazy when you're moving around modifiers. Don't get too happy with it, moving them everywhere. Just always ask yourself, is it still clear what this modifier is now modifying? And if it's not, then maybe that's not the best strategy because there are many other strategies you could use. Here's another one. Consecutive sentences the same way. A common problem that happens with this is when people use their plus the to be form of the verb, or it plus the to be form of the verb. That's known as an expletive construction. So if we have that, here's an example. There are many ways to eliminate monotony. It is a common problem writers face. Let's take that first sentence. There are many ways to eliminate monotony. There are. What I tell my students is most of the time, if you're starting a sentence with there are, there is, there were, there was, probably you could restate the sentence and get rid of that and then focus on the real subject. Same thing with the second sentence. It is a common problem writers face. There's probably a way that we could rewrite that and eliminate the it is. Then we start with the real subject. We're focusing on the real subject and the real verb, and the sentence is more meaningful and it's clearer. So for this one, there's another problem, and that is these sentences are pretty closely related, but they're separate sentences. So maybe we could combine them and we could fix a lot of problems. Here's an example. While sentence monotony is a common problem, notice I got rid of it is a common problem. Sentence monotony is a common problem. Writers can employ many strategies to eliminate it. Same facts, same substance. It flows a lot better. The relationship is clearer. And I've eliminated that awkwardness. So it works a lot better for the reader. So when you think about developing the paragraph, We've talked about unity, coherence, engagement, and now the last body paragraph point, developing it. How do we make it educational for the reader? We've already made it interesting, but how do we give them enough substance so that they feel it was worth their time? Because, again, readers are impatient. I'll go back to my examples reading student papers. I feel like when I get finished with a student paper that I want the amount of information I got out of it to equal or exceed even the amount of time it took me to read it. If I feel like it was very little payoff for the amount of time it took me to get through it, then I feel cheated. And readers feel cheated of their time, just like consumers might feel cheated of their money if they buy a product that doesn't work the way they wanted. So you want to make sure you give them a good investment and give them enough substance. So think about, when you're thinking about how to develop your paragraph, think about your reader's expectations and think about your topic sentence. The two go together. So have I satisfied the promise I made in this topic sentence for this particular reader? If you have, then your paragraph is over. It's time to end the paragraph. So try not to think about a number of sentences that you have to reach. Sometimes people are told a paragraph has to have 5 sentences or 7 sentences, or some teachers will even say 10. I really want you to just think about satisfying your topic sentences promise for your particular reader. And think about the needs of different readers. A non-expert is probably going to need less technical details than an expert would need. Paragraph might be shorter. So the strategy is going to mean different things for different types of readers. And the way that you fulfill that strategy is certainly going to be different. So think about what works. What ways to fulfill this strategy are going to work for you? Your topic sentence often dictates this. Is it a list of examples? Is it a description of the process? If you're making an argument, is it evidence to support your argument? If so, what kind of evidence is going to fully support your argument? Is it some kind of process where all you need is the chronology? Is it some kind of comparison and contrast where you really need to do an analysis and look for similarities or differences? So think about what's going to work, and then you make sure that you fulfill that for your reader that you've defined. And so remember, I gave introductions a shape. I imagine them as a funnel shape. I do the same thing for a body paragraph. Think about it this way when you're writing one. You establish your topic sentence. That's at the beginning. Then to develop it, you're going to have to extend out from that topic sentence. You're going to have to, if you're classifying, you're going to have to discuss the classification system and why Pluto no longer fits that classification as a planet. So you move away from your topic sentence a little bit. You have to develop your discussion, to develop your argument. But remember not to go too far away from it. Those transition words, they really act as anchors that keep you grounded, that keep that body paragraph related to that topic sentence. Then at the end, you might want to repeat a key word or two from your topic sentence. Remind your reader of what the point of the paragraph was. That's especially important in longer paragraphs because you need to make sure that the reader consistently feels like you haven't gone off into the atmosphere somewhere. A paragraph that's poorly developed, I'm going to try to draw on this thing because it looks pretty cool. Yeah, would do something like this. It just, one idea leads to the next, which leads to the next, and leads to the next, and then pretty soon, wow, you're so far away from your topic sentence that your reader's completely lost. It's easy to do that. It's surprisingly easy when you're really close to your topic. So, always go back and reread that topic sentence. Make sure that it still works with the topic sentence. Maybe to fix it, it could be very simple. Maybe you just slightly reword your topic sentence, and suddenly, everything, wow, that's cool. Everything comes right back to it. Let's see if the eraser works. This thing is so neat. So now we've gone through introduction, body paragraphs, and now the conclusion. Now I said the introduction was hard for a lot of people to write, so is the conclusion. When I read conclusion paragraphs that don't work, often it feels like just repetition. Maybe the student thinks, okay, I'm going to recap my points in this first sentence of the conclusion. Second sentence of the conclusion, I'm just going to recap them again. Third sentence, I'm going to find some creative way of saying pretty much exactly the same thing. And that's frustrating. And it can be frustrating not just for the reader, but for the writer. So what kinds of strategies can you use to make your conclusion really work as not only a resolution, you want your document to feel like there's a natural closing, but also you want to keep your readers interested again. Think about the reverse funnel. Think about the opposite of the introduction. You start out maybe with your recap. That's your most specific part. You're picking back up on the body. Then maybe you look to the future. Maybe you think about ethical implications of the technology you've been discussing. Maybe you think about the big picture issues. Maybe you talk more about practical applications, so you bring it back into the real world. You do something, some kind of strategy so that you're still reminding the reader of the important points, but you're broadening a little bit. So it really feels like it's come full circle if you can do that. So this, if you really wanted to think of the shape, this would be pretty close to the shape of the entire paper. Everything's connected. The introduction is pulling your reader in, gradually helping your reader get ready for the body. The body is the most narrow, it's the most specific and technical, and hopefully you've pulled the reader in enough so they're willing to invest that time, and then the conclusion you're broadening back out so that your reader feels like it was a worthy investment of time, and your reader feels like there's a natural close. It's come full circle. So ask yourself if you've done all you can to create an ordered context that promotes understanding and maintains interest, both at the same time. Help your reader feel like, yes, I've gotten a good education, there was real substance there, and it was also a pleasure to read. It was fascinating, it was worth my time, it felt relevant to me. Think of strategies you can use to make that happen. Leave you with a quote here before we get into a little exercise. The skill of writing is to create a context in which other people can think. So just remember this. When you're creating your document, when you're pulling everything together, the writing illustrates, it really reflects how you're thinking about a topic. I can see if your thinking is ordered or not, but more importantly, it's imposing that order on me. So if you come into it not really carefully considering what's going to be meaningful and helpful to the reader, using some of these strategies, then it's going to create muddled thoughts in my mind about the topic. So you have to be very careful. Think about an ordered context and then impose that order on your reader. All right, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mary Kay Ballant, and she's going to talk a little bit about putting some of this into practice. Let's see.
All right, so we're going to shift over to putting this into practice, as Amy said, and have some instructions up here. We're going to take a paragraph, and we're going to have you organize yourselves into small teams and work as teams to revise the paragraph. And before you move, let me show you the steps that we're going to make in this process. So the first thing that we'll ask you to do is to gather into small groups. I wasn't sure how many we would have here today, but given the number of people, I think if you break into groups of about 3 or maybe 4, depending upon how it all shakes out, that will be enough. Don't stretch to 5 people in a team. It will be easier to work if you're in a slightly smaller group. Once you've gathered into teams, you should read the paragraph. We're going to give you a piece of paper for each one of you with the paragraph on it. Feel free to write on it. It's yours to keep. Write your ideas and observations, and you should base those thoughts on all that you just heard Ms. Barton present to you. Thinking about the main categories that she talked about with the characteristics of the paragraph and how well this example paragraph fulfills it or where it doesn't fulfill it. You're going to be assigning someone to be a scribe once you work as a team, and you'll discuss it as a group, and the scribe, the person who's going to write down the revision, will write down your ideas, and as you frame new sentences and revise the paragraph, that person will keep track of what you've accumulated as a team. So we'd like you to evaluate the focus and the logical flow, the word choice and grammar and usage, all those elements that you've been exposed to over the past couple of workshops, as well as what you were introduced to today, and punctuation, and address those specific problems and revise the paragraph to correct them. You should also look at what works well. That's as helpful as anything, identifying when something works well and why it works well. That can really help you to provide a model of how you might want to adapt your own writing as you go forward. So before we shift over into Teams, and it'll take a couple of minutes for you to get arranged that way, and before I hand out the paragraph, I wanted to show you a couple of examples to look at and to remind you of the skills that you worked on in the last couple of workshops with Mr. Briccato. And I know your last workshop was in particular about sentence structure. And this can be a key element in making sure that your paragraph works properly, that the sentence structure of each sentence follows a proper format and achieves the goal that you want that sentence to do within the paragraph. And so here is the first of two examples. Both of these examples are from my previous students. So let's just look at this first one. The work environment could be improved so that the walls surrounding the table saw were insulated and soundproof to absorb and reduce the volume of the resonating sound waves of construction. So I hear a little bit of response to that. You can see that's not working optimally. It sounds like our author definitely knows what he or she is talking about, but it might not be clear to a reader that doesn't have a similar background. And we're usually trying to teach someone who doesn't have the same technical background as we have, right? So we have to consider that reader and what's going to help to organize that person's thinking. It's really a question of focus. So this particular student wrote me an email and sent me this passage and said, I don't understand how to take something like this and improve it. Would you mind sending me a revision that would be a good example, a good model for me to follow as I proceed with the course this semester? And so here is what I sent back. I'm sure it's not perfect, but I think it will provide an example for you. My revision was, wall insulation and soundproofing can improve the work environment by absorbing and reducing resonating sound waves created by construction equipment such as table saws. So you hear the logical order. The main idea in the sentence is defined early in the sentence. And then modifiers are coming afterward to help to organize the thinking, particularize the thinking, specify the thinking. But the reader already knows what we're talking about. The second example is a little bit more extensive, but it's similar in kind. If the system is overfilled, a whole new set of problems arises. The space that the unit is cooling will be cooled slightly faster, of course, but the load being placed on the air conditioning system is extremely problematic in the long run. The Freon will exist at a more liquefied state than it should. The aforementioned all-important vapor-liquid ratios will again be wrong. The main issue that comes from a more liquefied system is the amount of stress placed upon the compressor. Extra stress is placed in several locations, but the compressor gets the lion's share. Simply, liquid is much harder to pump through a system than vapor. So again, by the end of this bit of writing, I think we feel confident that this author knows what he or she is talking about. We trust the writer, but it's taken a while to get to that point. And so here's a proposed revision. Overfilling an air conditioning system may cool the space faster, but it can cause problems. An overfilled system causes the Freon to convert from vapor to liquid. This stresses the compressor, which has to work harder to pump liquid through the system. So you see, this is also a reduction in the number of words that were needed to convey the information. And it all is operating as a function of focus, deciding what is the focus of this sentence and going from there. So I hope that those examples will prove helpful to you. Here is our example of a problem paragraph, and just pass this out. You're welcome. Now again, keeping in mind Ms. Barton's instruction, the example that I just demonstrated for you was an example where a larger piece of writing was compressed and condensed into a shorter piece of writing. You may find that you need to expand. It depends upon the scope of what you wish to discuss, thinking about who the potential audience is. Is there more explanation that's needed? Is there more that's needed in order to help to focus the various elements of the paragraph? So don't feel constrained in any particular direction. Just evaluate this example that you have in front of you and come up with your ideas from there. And please feel free if you have questions. Mr. Brocado and Ms. Barton and I, any of us would be very happy to come to your teams if you would like. When you're ready, if you'd like to move down with this pair here, you could be in their team. Sure. You're welcome. It looks like people are in pairs and 3, so 2 is fine. They worked out pretty well. Should I turn off the record?